Greetings. Welcome back to the show. Today I'm going to continue reading some more of the stories. This particular story, though, for me, was probably one of the creepiest things that's ever happened. The reason I say that is not because the story itself is all that magnificent. It's just that, if you see a flying saucer, well, lots of people claim to have seen flying saucers. I mean, there's whole shows about them and so on. Our government's even had agencies that have studied them, Project Blue Book and so on. So it's really not that weird. A ghost. A ghost is just a long time thing in human history. We have so many ghost stories. If you happen to have encountered a ghost, well, you just join that group of humans that have had this experience, and there's really nothing that strange about it. This one, well, I have no idea what happened. It was really unusual, and it shook me up pretty bad. What I do know is something happened, and it wasn't ordinary. This is a non-ordinary experience. I call this Double Moonbow. It was a lovely autumn night with a bright full moon on the horizon. Ruth, Ken, and I sat in the kitchen of an old Victorian that I'd rented in Barrington, Illinois, just talking and telling stories. As goes sometimes with full moon nights, we found ourselves just filled with lunar energy. We decided to go for a moonlit stroll on the Ela Road side of the Deer Grove Forest Preserve. This was the lost side of the preserve, where hardly anyone ever went. The forest was full of old foundations from buildings long gone, and nearby was an abandoned cemetery that had some of the oldest gravestone markers in this area. Many of the gravestones dated back to the late 18th century and represented some of the original settlers in the area. We parked the car along Ela Road, started walking down the dirt path that led through the trees. Eventually, we came to an area where the forest thinned, and considering the foundations nearby, it was probably the remains of an old farm field. We walked in the moonlight until the trail headed into a dark and swampy patch of woods. None of us had a desire to enter the swamp forest. So we stood basking in the light and studying our surroundings. It was then that I noticed the moonlight had produced a double moonbow. This is similar to a rainbow, but the ghostly silver light of the moon was depicted in bows rather than the spectral colors of a rainbow. None of us had ever seen a moonbow before. Since that time, I've seen at least one on the big island of Hawaii, but they are a rather rare phenomenon. We were spellbound. Ruth and Ken were still staring at the moonbow when my attention was drawn to a rustling noise in the dry leaves about 15 feet into the brush at the side of the trail. Something was moving in the brush next to us. I became frightened and began to listen more closely to the sound. It sounded like someone pounding their feet up and down in the dry brush. It had a beat to it, as if it was a dance step. Soon the foot pounding was joined by the sound of heavy rhythmic breathing. The breath sounded like behind it, the footsteps were it was in sync with the breathing, and the overall effect was very musical. Next, the stamping and the breathing was joined by a third sound. It was like tinkling of glass wind chimes heard at a distance. It sounded almost as if something was opening up, as if there was a door being created. It was the most incredible sound, if you can imagine, this breathing, foot pounding, this tinkling noise. I was extremely frightened, because whatever was making this sound was not a creature that I had ever run across in the woods at night before. I asked Ken and Ruth if they could hear the sound, and the response left me flabbergasted. Ken claimed he could hear nothing at all. But I must be hearing things, he says. Ruth, on the other hand, could hear the sound, but only faintly. She said it sounded like distant music. I agreed with her on the music part, but on the distance, she was way off. The source of that sound was right on top of us. Before I could say another word, the noise began to move through the brush that paralleled the trail. It was heading away from us, back in the direction we had come from. The forest was dry and full of fall leaves. If something was moving through the woods, it should have made plenty of crunching sounds, but it did not. The sound moved along in the brush as if it was floating in the air. Eventually, it reached the place where the trail we had taken reached a T to the main trail. At this point, the sound took an abrupt right-hand turn and began to cross our path. In the moonlight, I could see a creature cross our trail. It was about 2 feet tall, and it walked on 2 legs like a man. I couldn't make out any real details in the moonlight, but a 2-foot-tall creature that made music and walked on its hind legs like a man was a terrifying sight in the woods at night. I started to freak, and I had to get out of the forest. To run away from the creature would have taken us the long way through the dark and swampy woods. The logical way out was the same direction the creature had gone. I decided to go in the direction it had gone because the dark woods were frightening by themselves, and even without any little 2-foot-tall fuckers. I grabbed Ruth's hand and I began running down the trail back to our car. Kent thought I was crazy because he had not heard a thing. He humored me, though, and began jogging out of the woods behind us. Ken had only recently returned from the war in Vietnam, about 12 months before. His body was in Illinois, but his mind was still on patrol in the jungles of Southeast Asia. We were about halfway out when Ken suddenly spun on his heel, turned around facing the brush behind us like he was holding an M16, and shouted, "I heard you, you motherfucker! Come on out and show yourself!" On the trail next to Ken's feet, there was a beer can that was still spinning in circles from something kicking it as it had crossed the trail behind us. Well, heard the can clunk from the strike, but Ken had reacted like he was still at war. I grabbed his hand and pulled on it until he gave in, and ran out of the woods as fast as we could move. Once back in the car, we began to compare notes and found that I was the only one who had both heard and seen the creature. Ruth had heard the musical sound and the can clunk, and Ken was very sure that something had been following us out of the woods. For me, it was one of the strangest moonlight walks I have ever taken. I suspect that unusual occurrences like moonbows are improbable enough, and that they affect our reality and open a gateway between dimensions. If the event is improbable enough, the gate can be open long enough for things to slip through. It's possible that the reasons I heard the creature so clearly is that I might have been the reason the gate opened. I really have no idea what it was that we witnessed. Words like fairy come to mind. Human mythology about fairies exist. Things like leprechauns and gnomes. I mean, this was an odd situation. The thing definitely chased us. Most 2-foot-tall little animals at night don't chase human beings out of the forest. So I'm completely mystified as to what this experience was, but I could tell you it left me terrified, and I've never been the same about walking in the woods at night. Aloha. Thanks for listening.